Good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Shea. I'm on the sustainability team at Interface. And real quick, I just want to give you a sense of, I think that was a wonderful introduction, Bill. I have no interest in flooring. It's not why I do what I do. That's why I have people like Erica and Kelly, because they're passionate about flooring. But for me, it's about a business trying to sort of carve a different way forward. And Ray Anderson's legacy is trying to design a better way to do business and actually do it at a scale that is harder to do that with, right? I don't let anybody at our company call us sustainable, and I don't say that we make sustainable products. We're still really far from that. Ultimately, that's a binary distinction. Can you do this thing the way you're doing it today in perpetuity? And we don't have very many examples of that, because almost everything we do is extractive, destructive, uses more resources than it replenishes, period. So it can't be sustainable in the way that we're operating today. I think it's really important that we're honest about some of those challenges. And I think it's especially important that you hear from companies that say that they're serious about this stuff, how hard it really is. So you're going to hear some of that from me. But I think Bill's introduction is a really great way to frame up what I've got for you here. And I have to say, I have two kind of firsts for you that I'm executing right now. First, I don't think I've ever presented in a country club before, so that's cool. And second, and more importantly, Dustin, I've never been over quota on man bun presenters in the same event. So thank you. It was wonderful to have. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of like why we're doing what we're doing and why I think it's so important. I set this up sort of like a CEU, but I'm not going to really dive into this. I'll give you a sense of some of the topics here. Embodied carbon, the carbon footprint of materials, supply chain related emissions. Why is that a leadership opportunity? Why is that important? Why does that matter in the context of big institutional buyers and carbon accounting, ESG metrics, any and all of those things? I'm probably in the way of the screen. I understand that. I'm going to wander around. Decarbonization and carbon accounting. What the interior design community and architecture can do and why it's a specifically important community for us to actually work with and work on kind of climate targets. And then some of the best practices are kind of tools. And just really quickly, because I haven't had a chance to do a very good job networking, raise your hand if you are a specifier. Yeah, that's what I thought. Raise your hand if you're a purchaser or you influence purchasing. Raise your hand if you are either an installer, a dealer, a distributor, or something like that. Vendor. Okay, cool. So we all have important roles to play here, but most of my content tends to be designed for the specifying community. So apologies if that's sort of my language and framework, but trust me, we can all participate. So this is one of my favorite things to show. And this slide is 3 minutes long, 2.5 minutes long. So just stare at it, don't look at me. What you're looking at is the concentration of CO2 in the air every day for a year. And this is from just a few years ago, I think it was 2022. And I'm not sharing this to be super sciencey. I'm certainly not sharing it to be political, not sharing it to be scary. First of all, I actually think this is beautiful. I think it's really fun to watch our world spin around and watch global air currents move things around. And I think it's an incredibly important reminder that we are part of this largest living system that we have ever found and that we can imagine. And we are contributing to cycles of growth and death every day that we operate and every day that we live on this world. And what you're seeing as we get into the summer is what is going to happen when the world begins to drink in all that excess CO2 as the forests of the northern hemisphere and the grasslands and the prairies leaf out. And look at how the concentration plummets as our natural systems use that carbon dioxide as a resource to build plant bodies. That's the magic of photosynthesis. Now again, why are we showing you this? Because this is the only place that we have to live, right? No planet B. Doesn't matter how old you are, this is where we're gonna be. I don't think we're gonna colonize Mars actually in our lifetime. Sorry, maybe bad news. But we are in this system. We are affecting this carbon cycle, whether we wanna be or not. And nobody intentionally tried to change the chemistry of our atmosphere to warm the planet up. Nobody set foot outside in pre-industrial England and said, like, this place is nice, but what if it were a little hotter? No, that's not why we started burning fossil fuels, right? We had all of these other goals. We wanted global travel. We wanted global supply chains. We wanted to grow. We wanted to build. perfectly noble goals. They had this side effect. They had this consequence that we didn't predict. And what that graphic is showing us is that we are part of these natural systems and we are overwhelming that typical kind of breathing process that our Earth goes through. And so we think about carbon dioxide a lot in the sort of typical parlance of our industry. When we say carbon, we mean any and all greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with products' life cycle, right? So carbon dioxide equivalent in EPD language. This is the specifier stuff. I know it's pretty boring. That's what we're looking at when we think about the carbon footprint of products. But in kind of historically, right, this is how the system of carbon and the cycle of carbon worked. You had plants pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, storing it in their bodies, growing, right? Natural, everything that is alive on this planet, everything we call organic chemistry. If you're a Star Wars fan or Star Trek fan, everything we are always looking for, carbon-based life forms, that's what we are. That's all we know. Over time, some of that stuff gets pulled under the Earth's crust and turns into fossil material, mineralized material, fossil fuels. The only sources of emissions on carbon were animal respiration, our exhales, right? Burn things, wildfires, forest fires, certainly, volcanic eruptions, all those things. But because life on Earth was so thriving and flourishing, we were always in a cycle where that stuff was getting drinking out of the air, right? Drunk out of the air and pulled back into a solid state. And it was our changes to this cycle that have in a really amazingly short period of time, as far as the Earth is concerned, changed those outcomes, changed the chemistry of the atmosphere and began to heat the planet. Now, it's very important that we recognize none of what I've just said, maybe you get it, maybe you care, maybe you don't, none of it tends to move the needle for people in terms of behavior change. And I'm hypercritical of the environmental movement as I've been exposed to it and what I've learned about it over the last 50 to 60 years, because I think it's done a really poor job of getting people on the bus, the carbon-free bus. We need to do a much better job at encouraging people to find their way in to the solutions that we know we need to develop for the future, regardless of segment, regardless of activity, regardless of their role. And so, for me, one of the important things, and I think it's critical for this particular community, is to connect climate impacts with public health. So I just had a conversation actually with Erica earlier today and others about what's changing globally is very hard to kind of relate to, but the impacts that we feel locally and the public health consequences of those changes are much more real. So I grew up in North Carolina. I remember when it was a really rare situation to hear about a case of West Nile virus or malaria in the state. That happens every summer now. For you all, it's less about mosquitoes, it's more about ticks. Sorry, grosser, in my opinion. You have more ticks up here. They're more likely to come in contact with people, and as winters get more mild and shoulder seasons get more mild, they are living in higher populations and they're more likely to bite people and spread disease. Lyme disease is super on the rise everywhere north of the Mason-Dixon line in North America. That is related to climate change. But that is a public health consequence that is changing our outcomes and changing what is likely to be faced by our communities, by our loved ones, by our neighbors. So I'm not going to ever encourage anybody to go and try to get somebody to act differently because of parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Like, guess what? It doesn't work. Even if we understand and accept the science and we're motivated by that to some extent, it doesn't feel like it should change our behavior. But what if it is your kid's health at stake? What if it is higher rates of asthma because of air pollution? That's much more relevant for me in Atlanta, right? So I bring this up because this was on the CDC's website for years and years and years, is how they described why they say climate change is the greatest threat to public health of the 21st century. Not war, not famine, not, God forbid, another COVID version, climate, right? So we have to think about how we relate, especially as we talk about things like ESG goals and, again, institutional buyers and large organizations. Well, what's the point of it all? And what is related to our mission and the language that we would typically share with taking care of our communities? Well, what about making sure that people are staying healthy? What about acting in a resilient way, acting in a way that is responsive to the challenges that we face and what the challenges that we know we're going to face? And so this is one of my favorite slides that I get to put up, Because it is, again, a reminder that nobody intentionally tried to change the atmosphere. Nobody wanted to warm the planet. But also, we are the most powerful species that has ever existed on this planet. Personally, I don't think we're as cool as dinosaurs, but this was an amazing outcome of us designing what we call the global economy, right? But it also should empower us to realize we can go the other direction if we want to. We got ourselves into this situation. We can get ourselves out. It is a question of design. It is a question of intent. It is a question of creativity. It is a question of commitment. And the opportunity is there. So let's get a little bit more tactical. Now that was sort of big picture. How do companies understand their climate impact? How do they talk about carbon emissions? I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this. You can certainly ask me questions after if we have any time. But there is a common language rooted in what's called the Greenhouse Gas Inventory or Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is internationally recognized. So it's not just a US or North America thing. It's not just a specific segment thing. It's about everybody who is counting carbon, and that's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions, fuel that you actually burn, direct emissions that you're responsible for. Scope 2 emissions, the emissions that you buy, typically in the form of energy, right? For me, down in Georgia, that's a pretty ugly mix of stuff, okay? For somebody in Seattle or the Pacific Northwest, they have a lot more energy coming from hydroelectric power. It's way different carbon footprint per kilowatt hour, right? You all are probably somewhere in the middle, but closer to me in this part of the country. Scope 3 emissions, everything else that a company does or an organization does that causes emissions to go in the air somewhere. This gets very complicated. There are 16 subcategories. Don't worry, there's not a quiz. Couple of examples on scope 1 and 2 because we're going to focus mostly on scope 3 in a minute. Scope 1, again, it's usually combustion related, but one sort of fun fact is in our industry, as in architecture and design and construction, AEC, Seth, the concrete industry actually has a significant amount of process emissions. When you cure concrete together, one of the things that happens is it actually off-gases CO2. So a fun kind of example of a scope 1 emission that is not combustion related, but for the most part, we're talking about burning fuel. Scope 2, again, energy that you buy. The only example that's not electricity is maybe something like steam, but again, for most of us, it's just going to be electricity. And then we get to scope 3. Now, the important thing to understand about scope 3, and I sort of framed it in that way that it is very, very broad, is that a lot of estimates say, and one study that I looked at from the Carbon Disclosure Project said, typical companies' scope 3 emissions are 11 times that of their scope 1 and 2 combined. For us at Interface, I can tell you that because we do pretty thorough carbon reporting, only 2% of our carbon footprint is combined scope 1 and 2. 98% of the emissions that we are responsible for either creating or calling on the demand for come from mostly our supply chain, which is my next slide in a minute, and the other kind of things that we either invest in or operate in, whatever. A couple of examples of what scope 3 categories look like. Again, not super important. What I'm really going to ask you to focus on is category 1 in the Greenhouse Gas Inventory Protocol is purchased goods and services. All the stuff you buy, all the services that you buy for it, right? And in some cases, depending on the economic sector, like a bank, for example, investments is its own subcategory. If you're a bank, that's a huge piece of your kind of climate impact, right? But for most of us, that's not really worth mentioning. The purchased goods and services, even regardless almost of your business model, as you can see, these are kind of leading carbon reporting organizations that we found. Major retailer, you have us as a manufacturer, financial services, and then a higher ed institution. This is the category 1, the spend-related emissions of everything that they buy compared to the rest of their scope 3. So over half of an area that has 16 subcategories come from just the first one. Now, why does this matter for this room? Because that's actually what we affect. It's the supply chain of buildings. So you may have heard the statistic that 40% of global emissions every year come from buildings or the built environment. I'm sure you have, because you're all watching the same documentary as I am. But if you dig into that a little bit more, we're looking at somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of that impact comes from operating our homes and workplaces alone. So just residential and commercial space, just flipping on the lights, turning the HVAC system on, turning the security system on, charging our iPhones, 28% of global emissions every year. The 11% wedge that's pulled out is what we call the embodied carbon footprint of all the stuff with which we build. So everything we're looking at in this beautiful John Houken RLPS design room came to this job site with a carbon footprint. Every chip of paint, this beautiful carpet that we're walking on. Sorry, I love you, just kidding. The structural material, the exit signs, the glazing, all of it, right? So that supply chain related stuff is bound up in the life cycle of each individual product. And the bulk of building materials have the kind of majority of their climate impact and consequence in those upstream phases of its life cycle. Because the intensity of material extraction and processing, creation of something like plastic in the first place, greatly eclipses how far it traveled to get to job site, most manufacturing processes, the cleaning and maintenance of it, over a certain amount of time. So it really is that in that supply chain, those early life cycle stages, where we need to focus our time. Again, favorite slide. So now we know how companies talk about carbon footprint, right? And that building products in particular are a big chunk of emissions globally and therefore for each individual company, right? So what do we do with this information? Well, we believe, and it goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning, you have to have the right mindset to make the level of change that we need to. And I think it's really important that we try to take a positive approach to what the opportunity is and not sort of like a scare, blame, and shame approach to trying to fix a problem. So what if we could look at the challenges that are presented to us around global environmental issues and climate as the world's greatest ever design brief? What would it look like? How would it feel if we treated those as constraints for our future solutions? Not just something to be afraid of and either deny or, tell people that if they don't do something about their bad. Again, not the right way to get people on your team. We've tried that for a long time. Doesn't work, right? So can we take this type of approach where we have to have a design thinking mindset, be positive, be determined, be courageous, be inventive, rely on our creativity, and see how far we can get? And again, we kind of got ourselves into this situation, so clearly we can get ourselves out. And this was the mindset that we took to solving different problems. Again, I want to be able to get on a plane and go to Bangalore. Now, how do we solve that problem? We invent airports, we invent airlines, we invent commercial, right? Commercial airlines, right? So we have tremendous capacity to change and develop and sort of revolutionize systems, and we need to take that approach. When you look at taking that approach as a company, this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about interface. This is a bar chart graph that we show all the time. It was last published in, I think it was like October of last year, maybe it was earlier last year. So there's one major manufacturer in the flooring space that is not represented on carpet tile here, and that's Tarkett. I'm not trying to hide their data, they just didn't have current EPDs when we published this. We're getting it back on, blah, blah, blah. But everybody else here is represented. And this is actually unique. Most categories of building products don't have this level of transparency and data for you. Carpet tile is, for whatever reason, ahead of the game. But a couple things to note here. Number one, there's a big difference in the lowest carbon footprint that is offered on this chart and the highest. There's a big range. The bottom number, which I'm sure you can all read from especially the back, is 2.2. Even if you take out the carbon storing product, the negative number, just take that out for now. 2.2, the top number is 18.1. That means there's almost a 9x difference in the amount of carbon that goes into the air for making a meter squared of carpet tile from one manufacturer's kind of top performing product to another manufacturer's not top performing product. Now, obviously, different reasons that you have different construction, so it's not so much about always pick the lowest footprint available. It's not really that simple. That's not why we show this. The other thing, though, to note is that if you just pick your favorite color on this chart, doesn't matter who it is, the difference between the shortest bar that manufacturer offers and the tallest by percentage is huge. So why is that significant? Because with this level of visibility, and again, whether you're a specifier, and this is the type of data that you work with all the time, whether you're a dealer or a contractor who deals with this only on the VE process, right? Or whether you're a purchaser or kind of an owner influencer, when you're thinking about setting standards, when you're thinking about pursuing corporate sustainability goals or defining that both for your communities, your residents, as well as your employees, well, what if we can set thresholds for carbon performance in the stuff that we buy? With this type of transparency, you can do that. And you can feel really good about, well, we've picked a number that is going to guarantee the right amount of competition from different manufacturers, right? Make sure that we're not sacrificing a performance element that we can't live without in terms of product and quality, but also allow us to demonstrate that we have baked into our processes around procurement, around material and decision-making, a kind of values-oriented, carbon stance, right? Now, all of those were just one product, right? But I showed you, ooh, wow, that's different. I showed you the wedge of the global carbon footprint, coming from just the supply chain of buildings. That's the embodied carbon footprint. Why would we focus on the carbon footprint of materials when, of course, operating your buildings is still not? First of all, it's not an either or. We got to do all of it. We got to do it both. Please continue to build tight envelopes. Please have good U values on windows. Please have good insulation. All that stuff still matters. But if we don't pay attention to the supply chain related impact of the stuff with which we build, we're not going to go nearly as far. And that's because of two main reasons. Number one, not all carbon emissions are created equal because they don't all happen at the same time. And we don't have infinite time to do something about this challenge. And number two, we can change the carbon impact of a building over time, but we cannot change emissions that are already in the air. So the only moment in time that we have to influence the supply chain related emissions of the stuff that we buy is in material selection and in product specification. So if you look at this chart, this is one building. Let's say it was built in 2020. There's going to be a big chunk of carbon that goes into the air for all that supply chain related emissions. Over time, the operational footprint of this building is going to eventually eclipse the amount of carbon that was spent to make all this stuff, right? But what this data tells us, and it's from Architecture 2030, compiled by the International Energy Agency, one of the sort of foremost leading organizations on energy-related emissions in the world, it's going to take 30 years for that ratio to flip. Okay, what does this mean? Why does this matter? Think about it this way. For a building built in 2020, by the year 2050, fully half of the climate consequence of that project will have happened in 2019. And some of you are very savvy and you're noticing that is a flat red line. That means we didn't renovate this building at all. If you add interior renovation into the equation, it actually gets longer. And oh, by the way, some of you are also thinking, well, 2050 is probably too late for us to really do something about it. You're right, so let's draw that line at 2030. Guess what? The closer you are to the beginning of a building's lifespan, the more proportionally important the carbon footprint of all the supply chain is. And as we continue to, as a society, address this issue, right, we're going to have a greener energy grid. That's absolutely going to happen, right? We're already seeing it. So we can say maybe that gray line will flatten out. Maybe it'll go down. Maybe it'll be a net zero. Maybe all buildings will end up being net zero energy pretty soon. I don't know, ideally. Maybe it happens in 5 years. Come on. But even if that were the case, if we don't address the carbon emissions of material extraction, processing, development, manufacturing, right, we're still in trouble. So we have to do both. And I showed you that graph. This is an equivalent, different data set, showing you it was about a 20-year kind of ratio flip. But again, what happens when you add the renovation cycle in? It's a huge differentiator. In the second kind of data set that I was looking at, it actually doubles the amount of time it takes for the operational footprint of that building to catch up to the initial carbon footprint of the construction and the renovation over time. Now, you all are representing a segment that does build new, certainly, but also does a lot of renovation and has owners that are invested in spaces for a long time. So why does that matter? Because we need to, when we're doing a major new construction or a major renovation, we need to think about the supply chain of all that material, right? And the carbon of all that material. But even when we are just doing a refresh of a space, this is important data for us to consider, okay, how are we kind of demonstrating our values and how are we going to communicate this again to employees, to the community, and make a difference? We can decarbonize even just that renovation process. You need this type of data visibility, and because the renovation cycle is a way to really only add kind of embodied carbon to the equation of a building, we have to also think really critically about circularity. So the second sort of element of this presentation, and I don't have too much more to go, but is really about what do we do with this information and how do we decarbonize the decisions that we're making. And one of the primary ways to do it is to think much more critically about circular economy. So this is a really hot topic. It's a common thing to talk about, but nobody really knows how to do it. And that's because we are extremely indexed into a take, make, waste economy. This is a Ray Anderson quote. We take stuff out of the earth, we make stuff out of it, we waste it. Humans invented waste, invented trash, and boy, have we got a lot of it, right? We make a whole bunch of stuff that nothing on the planet eats, which means it just hangs around, right? My favorite example is plastic utensils. 200 million year old ingredients that we're going to use for 3 minutes, and we're going to throw away, and it's not going to rot or break down for 700 years. What are we doing? It's a really challenging mindset because we are so deep in it. We need to think really differently. So this is a little graphic that shows you a couple of different sort of circularity strategies, right? I love this representation because the sort of size of the loops should give you a sense of the both energy burden and the logistical intensity of trying to execute those different strategies. In the flooring world, we are challenged a lot as especially carpet manufacturers and carpet tile manufacturers to think about recycling. I actually think Interface deserves some credit / blame for that being the case, right? It was Ray Anderson's sort of change and turn to using recycled content, wanting to get product back and see if he could remanufacture stuff out of it that made that a conversation in carpet tile. But we have very little attention being paid to any of these other perfectly good circularity strategies. And in fact, some of them will make a lot more sense. So I did this exercise in a morning presentation. But raise your hand if you think you know somebody or a business that would reupholster something. Raise them higher. Okay, that's awesome. If I ask that question in most areas of this country, I get nothing. I get crickets. Why is that? Because our economy has developed so much dependence on, in a lot of cases, global manufacturing and global supply chains and new stuff, that we have lost an entire class of skill around that type of artisanship. It is especially relevant to things like furniture, but it is not exclusive to furniture, right? Seth, you made a really great point about health systems and kind of conglomeration, right? Rural hospitals, and this has been the case for decades already, are either dying or they're getting absorbed. That's a problem all over the South. I'm sure it's a problem up here. What are the consequences of that? Well, sometimes it's access. That's a really clear one. But what about the consequences of having everything in a sort of conglomerated business model? Do you lose a sense of who is in the community and what services are really needed? Do you lose a sense of comfort and connection to the care and the care providers, right? And so I think it's similar in terms of product. We need to reinvest and reinvigorate, and for better or worse, the tariffs are apparently intended to do this, right? Where we are going to improve, hopefully, American-made manufacturing or American goods or American, at-home kind of businesses to support all the stuff that we buy. I hope it works. But we what is our role in this room? What demand are we signaling to the market? Are we ever asking, hey, do you have a refurbished version of this? Are we ever asking residents who are moving in, especially if it's a major renovation or we're adding a wing or whatever, hey, do you want to bring any furniture? Can we take you antique shopping? As opposed to furnishing just through OEMs, right? And then what's the equivalent too of keeping this really highly engineered commercial grade stuff that we have in circulation? How many offices are full of ancillary furniture that get tossed after a lease is up in 3 or 5 years when there are senior living facilities down the road that are languishing with super ugly kind of beaten up stuff that's 25 years old? Can we kind of square that circle, right? So a couple of examples on just the flooring side about how we can actually kind of engage in circularity practices a little bit more creatively. I think we've lost a lot of the value prop around carpet tile. The original thing that made Ray Anderson so excited that he just couldn't wait to sell it and made him go out on his own and spurn his very good job at a major carpet mill was selective replacement. You stain a part of a broadloom carpet and how much are you ripping up and how ugly is it to patch? You stain carpet tile, pull 2 of them up and put them down. And guess what? It looks pretty good, right? So I think that's a part of how we need to retrain our brains to think about, well, what problem can we solve? And what is the sort of most ecologically sensitive, but also maybe smartest, just a better design, right? It's gonna be cheaper too, by the way, for sure, right? So selective replacement is one, but then also repair. If you look at really higher performance material, in this case, this is rubber flooring, Nora rubber flooring Interface purchased in 2018. One of the things that's impressed me a ton about this particular product is it's homogeneous. It's a very simple material, right? It's basically synthetic rubber all the way through, which means that if it gets gouged, if it gets borderline destroyed, you can actually fill that in and repair it right there on site. This is super valuable in healthcare facilities and lab spaces that are super expensive to shut down, right? If you can get away with not having to shut down an OR for hours or half a day because you just need to patch a floor, you're going to want that flexibility all day long. Similarly, I know this is probably too hard to see from the back, but really scuffed up, visually kind of failing or super ugly material, if it is the right kind of product, can be just literally buffed out, restored. This is one of the sort of major value props of Nora, and look brand new. Why is this significant? Because it means that we're putting down a floor that is going to last forever, and if we're installing it well, it is going to last the lifetime of the building. Truly, I'm not exaggerating. We have installs that are 50 years old in airports. Okay? Please don't rip it out because you're tired of the color or because you think it's gotten too dirty. Like that's again, how do we train ourselves to use what, maybe I'm framing it as a circularity solution, but it's just a maintenance regimen. It's actually going to make a difference and keep that floor serving a purpose and providing value to that space for a long, long time, right? Okay, so a couple last things, just resources and materials to dig into. I'm a really firm believer that a more circular economy is going to be a series of more regional economies rather than big centralized national and international stuff. I think all of our sort of economic models and scale and the way that we justify the logistical burden and the diversity of everything that everyone that we sell to coming from kind of one location is that it has to be this new stuff. We have to have a whole lot of externalized environmental cost in the system. And if we want to get away from that, I think rehoming a lot of our economic impact is going to make a big difference. So this is a map that shows you different partners around the country and a couple in Canada that are part of a network of, they do various things, but they are all invested in reusing, reselling, salvage material, keeping stuff in circulation. I think this is super futuristic. By the way, it's going to be a little bit messier for the near term because you're not going to be able to call just the same brand or the same mill. You're not going to always have the full quantity of stuff that you're looking for from one supplier. That doesn't mean that it's not possible. It doesn't mean that it's not out there. It doesn't mean we can't solve that problem. We're just going to have to think a little bit more creatively and do it a little bit differently, right? So the first thing, look for your local partners, and specifically the All for Reuse map from Build Reuse, which is a big network of nonprofit and associated partners, is a good one. This is, again, super focused on the specifying community, but I even think for the rest of y'all, and I'm not going to spend long on this, this is a really comprehensive set of resources and information about different ways to approach sort of decarbonizing the renovation process in interior design that the Metropolis team, like Interior Design Magazine, did. They've actually been working on making it a much simpler kind of set of instructions, so hopefully a little bit more palatable and easy to use, but even before that, there's a ton of information in there about everything from getting project teams together to sort of set goals and set targets to how to use the data that's out there in terms of VPDs and that sort of thing. So it's a really good sort of resource to read up on. If you want to introduce the concept of low carbon products and carbon emissions in the supply chain to your project teams, if you want to challenge an architect on it, if you want to integrate it into your project team goals, right? I think this is a really great place to start. Another totally free resource, materialspalette.org. They have what they call a carbon smart materials palette that will give you a little short magazine article on every individual material that you see on here. Why is it carbon intensive? Where's the carbon emissions coming from? What are some rules of thumb to get to a lower footprint material? And the good news on this is that these are the types of rules of thumb that you can look for across manufacturers, right? It's going to be available from different providers, which means that you don't have to lock yourself into either one provider or worry too much about what the impact on budget is going to be. I can't guarantee you that a lower carbon product is always going to be available at cost parity, but I actually would be surprised if it's not. Because how ridiculous would it be if I came to you and I said, we make low carbon products and that's why they're so expensive? No, nobody cares. That's not a differentiator that you can go get business with, right? So no one's been selling you on the value of low carbon, even if they have that available. Let's make that something that is a differentiator. Let's make that a performance characteristic we can go after. And then the most technical tool that I'll just share with you and tell you about, but I'm not going to really walk into, is again free from buildingtransparency.org, a nonprofit up in the Seattle area. And they developed what's called the EC3 tool, Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator. Again, pretty focused on the specifying community, but I definitely have seen owners use this tool to understand what is a baseline carbon footprint for a typical material that we use or a material that we use a lot of, and how do we set a standard to make sure that we're kind of having good carbon performance, and again, can report that, talk that into our ESG goals, our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions accounting, et cetera, right? So the EC3 tool, really, really strong. This is one of the outputs that they will offer you. What you're looking at is every individual category of product that was put into this small renovation. The top of each bar is the sort of conservative high-end average estimate for the carbon footprint of a typical product in that category. The low end is the 20th percentile of EPD data, so sort of an achievable but an ambitious low carbon target. And then somewhere in the middle is usually what you'll actually specify or choose, right? So this tool is helping you track based on quantity and the amount of carbon per unit of that product that you're using. What is the impact, and how does it help you demonstrate an actual much lower carbon footprint compared to a baseline building with the same bill of materials, right? So again, free, open source, a really good place to dig in. And then if you want to stay analog, we always encourage these two books. So Build Beyond Zero and its sister book, The New Carbon Architecture, both predominantly written by a man named Bruce King, which are really about low carbon and carbon storing materials, a lot of natural materials, a lot of kind of digging into where those supply chains come from. And then there's Project Drawdown, developed in 2016, I believe, and it's about the top 100 solutions that humans have at our fingertips today to either dramatically reducing the amount of carbon that goes into the air or pulling it down and using it in a solid state. Important because it has solutions that you would expect, like offshore wind and recycling and reducing food waste, but it also has stuff that you might not expect. Like 2 of the top 5 solutions are educating women and girls around the world and providing them family planning resources and information, because that would have a massive impact on both population growth and who can participate in the global economy, right? So there's some sort of social engineering elements of the mathematical modeling that they did, which is really interesting. Very thought-provoking book, and really beautiful because it is full of nothing but stuff that we could just work on scaling today that would make a huge difference. And it really, really kind of inspiring and thought-provoking read. Also pretty easy. It's like basically like a coffee table reader, so each solution is really only 2 pages, and there's beautiful pictures and all that kind of thing. So that's it. Would love to hear any thoughts or questions that you have if we have any time, but otherwise, thanks for listening.